It happened on a cold evening I'll never forget. My son Ethan looked me straight in the eyes, pointed toward the old wooden doghouse behind the shed, and told me that's where I should sleep. For a moment I thought he was joking. I waited for him to smile to take it back, but he didn't. His expression stayed flat, almost proud, like he'd finally said something he'd been holding in for years. My hands started to shake, not from the cold or from age, but from something far heavier, disbelief. That doghouse, I had built it with my own hands decades ago. Every board, every nail, every bit of paint had come from my work, my sweat, my life. I built it for a family dog that's long gone. Now my own son thought it was good enough for me. I didn't say a word. The air between us was thick and silent. You know that kind of silence that feels like it has weight, like it could crush you if you breathe too hard. That's what it felt like standing there. He turned and walked back inside without looking back. The porch light flickered on for a second, catching the edge of his smirk before the door shut. I just stood there staring at the shadows stretching across the yard. Inside my chest, something cracked, not loudly, not like glass, but quietly like wood bending under pressure. You don't notice it right away, but you know something has changed forever. That night I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall I once painted with my wife before she passed. Her laughter still lived in these walls, but the laughter that came from the other side of the house, now it wasn't hers, it was Ethan's. He was telling the story to someone. I could hear him laughing about it, turning my humiliation into entertainment. Each laugh hit like a hammer. I didn't sleep that night. I just listened to the wind outside, to the sound of my own heart, trying to stay calm. Somewhere deep down, something in me was shifting. I didn't know it yet, but that moment standing in the dark, listening to my own son laugh at me, was the exact point when everything in my life began to change. I could hear the laughter through the walls that night. It wasn't just laughter. It was the kind that carries mockery, the kind that makes your skin tighten, even if you're alone. Ethan was in the living room retelling what he'd said to me earlier, repeating the line about the doghouse like it was some kind of punchline. His friends laughed with him. My humiliation had become a story worth sharing. I sat there on the edge of my bed, hands folded, staring at the floor. I didn't move. The sound of their voices came in waves, booming, careless, echoing through the hallways I built with my own hands. Each laugh felt like a nail being driven into the walls of my chest. It's strange how quickly a home can turn into something else. Once those walls had carried birthday songs, bedtime stories, and the smell of my wife's cooking. Now they carried laughter that didn't belong to love anymore, it belonged to cruelty. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't show on your face. It just settles deep inside, quiet and heavy. That night I felt it for the first time. My own son's laughter had become the sound of betrayal. I looked at the old photographs on the dresser. One was from his graduation day. I remembered how proud I'd been, how I stood there in that same living room, clapping louder than anyone else. That memory used to warm me. Now it burned. In that moment, something inside me started to shift. Pain has this strange ability. It can turn into fire if you let it. And the longer I sat there, the more I realized I couldn't keep letting that fire consume me. I had to shape it into something else. I thought about all the years I had worked double shifts, the nights I came home too tired to eat, the times I said no to myself so Ethan could have what he wanted. Every sacrifice, every choice, every ounce of pride I'd swallowed for him, it all came rushing back. I started to understand something I had never wanted to admit. Sometimes love blinds you. You give and give and give until one day you realize the person you were building for doesn't see the builder anymore. They just see the house. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me clear. Clearer than I'd been in years. I wasn't planning revenge. I didn't want to scream or prove him wrong. I just wanted peace, the kind of peace that comes when you finally see the truth for what it is. That night, while he laughed, I sat there in silence. And in that silence, I made a promise to myself. I would never beg for respect again. It didn't come with thunder or shouting or tears. It came quietly, like the start of a storm you can feel before it arrives. I knew something was coming. I didn't know how or when, but I knew the man I was before that night was gone. As I sat in that quiet room, the sound of laughter fading through the walls, my eyes fell on the photographs lined along the shelf. Dust had settled on the frames, but I could still see the moments shining through. Ethan as a boy sitting on my shoulders. Ethan at his high school graduation wearing a cap too big for his head. Ethan smiling next to his mother during one of our Sunday dinners, the kitchen filled with the smell of roasted chicken and laughter. I could almost hear it again, the clinking of forks, the way my wife used to hum while serving mashed potatoes, Ethan asking for seconds, promising he'd clean his plate this time. Back then our table felt warm like the heart of the world. Those memories hit differently now. The same walls that had witnessed years of love were now holding something darker, disrespect, pride, distance. It's strange how time can twist a place. A home can still look the same and yet feel completely empty. I remembered the nights when I'd worked double shifts at the factory, the smell of oil on my hands, the ache in my back the way I'd come home and sit in the car for a few extra minutes before walking in just to catch my breath. But no matter how tired I was, I always smiled when I saw the lights on in Ethan's room. It meant he was home safe, studying, living the life I wanted him to have. I had skipped dinners, postponed doctor visits, and put off my own dreams so he could chase his. I told myself that was what fathers did. You work, you sacrifice, you build something stronger than yourself. And I believed that one day, when he was grown, he would see it. He would understand that everything he stood on was built from my hands. But that night when he told me to sleep in the doghouse, all of that came crashing down. I realized he didn't see me anymore. He only saw what I represented, an old man, a burdened someone who used to matter. There's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't need shouting or tears. It just sits inside you, cold and heavy. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was hollow. Like someone had quietly stolen everything I believed about love and family. I thought about the times I carried him on my shoulders when his feet were too small to reach the ground. I thought about the Christmas mornings when I'd stay up late assembling his toys, pretending to be Santa so he'd wake up to magic. I remembered how his mother and I used to laugh at the way he'd run down the hallway, socks sliding on the floor. Now those same feet had walked past me without a glance. The same voice that once called me Dad with excitement now used it like an insult. That's when I understood something most people learn too late. Love without respect turns into pity, and pity never heals a relationship. The room felt smaller that night. The walls seemed to lean closer, pressing the air around me. I looked down at my hands, old wrinkles scarred from years of work. These were the hands that built this house, fixed every leek planted, every flower in the yard. Every corner of this home was a piece of me. But pride had replaced gratitude, and arrogance had erased memory. I realized then that my sacrifices had become invisible, not because they didn't matter, but because they were too familiar. The people who benefit from your effort the most are often the first to forget how much it cost you. I didn't cry, I didn't even sigh. I just sat there, thinking about how fragile love can be when pride steps in. I promised myself that night that I would never again beg to be seen. The love I gave had already built more than walls. It had built character, opportunity, and life. If Ethan chose to forget that, I wouldn't remind him with words. Sometimes silence is the only language left when love has been misunderstood. The next morning the house was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I woke up before the sun, like I always did, and went about my routine as if nothing had happened. Old habits are hard to break even when your heart feels cracked open. I swept the porch, watered the small row of flowers by the fence, and took my time trimming the wilted ones. The air was cool damp from the night before, and I could smell the faint scent of grass mixed with the coldness of early dawn. For a brief second it felt peaceful until I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Ethan walked past, phone in hand, car keys swinging. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at me, just moved like I wasn't there. That small moment, one glance that never came, felt heavier than any insult. I stood still, broom in hand, watching him unlock the car. He smiled at his reflection in the window, adjusted his collar, and drove off, music blaring. For him, it was just another morning. For me, it was the day I realized pride can make people blind. When arrogance takes over, people stop seeing what's right in front of them. They stop seeing the roof over their head, the food on their plate, the hands that built the world they live in. They only see themselves. As the sound of his car faded down the road, I sat back down on the porch steps. The wood creaked under my weight, the same way it did when Ethan was a boy, sitting next to me with a scraped knee, asking me if pain ever really goes away. Back then, I told him it does if you're patient. Now sitting alone, I wondered if I had lied. The sun started to rise, light spilling over the yard, touching everything except the space inside me. The flowers looked alive, the birds sang, but the air around me felt hollow. A house can be filled with noise and still feel empty when no one sees you anymore. That morning I learned something about silence. It doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means distance. Sometimes it's the quiet that follows after respect has died. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow. Even the family dog, old and slow, came and sat near my chair as if to remind me I wasn't completely invisible. It's a strange thing when an animal shows you more kindness than your own blood. I took a sip of tea, now cold, and thought about how quickly love can turn into indifference when pride moves in. You can live under the same roof, share the same meals, breathe the same air, and still be strangers. That was the moment I began to understand that love needs to be seen to survive. Otherwise it fades quietly, like morning fog that disappears while no one's watching. I stayed on that porch long after Ethan left, staring at the gate, the yard, the life I had built, plank by plank. Everything around me looked exactly the same, yet it all felt foreign. I was a guest in my own home, and for the first time I felt the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, it comes from being forgotten. Days began to blur together after that morning. I still woke up early out of habit. I still swept the porch, watered the flowers, made tea. But the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum of things that used to matter. At breakfast we sat at the same table, but the silence between us was louder than any argument. Ethan scrolled through his phone, his wife cut her toast, and I quietly spooned what was left of my oatmeal. No one looked up, no one spoke my name. The portions on my plate had grown smaller. At first I thought it was an accident, a simple oversight, but over time I realized it wasn't. It was a message, a quiet one. A way of saying that I took up too much space, even in the kitchen I had remodeled myself years ago. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who pretend not to see you. It doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in slowly, meal by meal, day by day, until you begin to feel like a shadow passing through the rooms you once filled with laughter. Even the family dog seemed to sense the shift. He'd rest his head on my lap sometimes, looking up at me with those old loyal eyes, as if to remind me that someone still remembered who I was. Funny, isn't it, that a dog can notice what people choose to ignore? One afternoon I caught sight of that old wooden doghouse through the window. the same one Ethan pointed to when he told me where I belonged. The sun hit it just right, casting a long shadow across the yard. To anyone else, it was just a small, rotting structure. To me, it was a monument to humiliation, a symbol of how far we had fallen, not in wealth, but in heart. I thought about tearing it down once, but I didn't. Maybe I wanted it there. Maybe I needed a reminder of how cruel people can become when they forget gratitude. As the days went by, I stopped talking as much. Every word felt wasted. Every attempt at conversation met with short replies or blank stares. I began moving around the house quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone. It was easier that way, to exist in silence. I'd catch reflections of myself in the hallway mirror sometimes, an old man moving through his own house like a visitor, my steps lighter, my voice softer, as if I was trying not to leave footprints. That's when it truly hit me. I was still there, but no longer part of it. I was living in the same space, but I had already been erased from their world. I remember one night hearing Ethan and his wife laughing in the living room. Their voices carried through the thin walls the same way my wife's laughter used to. I almost smiled out of habit, thinking it was her. Then I remembered she was gone, and the laughter I heard wasn't love, it was life moving on without me. That night I sat by the window watching the moonlight fall on the yard. The doghouse stood under that pale light, quiet and empty. I realized that I had become like it, once useful, once cared for, now forgotten. You don't need to die to become a ghost. Sometimes all it takes is being unseen by the people you love the most. Still, I stayed, not because I was weak, but because I wasn't ready to let go of the hope that maybe someday they'd see me again. Maybe one morning Ethan would sit beside me, ask how I slept, offer a cup of coffee the way he used to. But deep down, I knew that day would never come. And when you finally accept that truth, something inside you changes. The pain starts to feel different. It no longer breaks you. It begins to harden you, to prepare you for what comes next. There's a moment after deep humiliation when everything goes quiet. Not around you, but inside you. It's the kind of silence that feels both heavy and clear, like the world has stopped shouting long enough for you to finally hear your own thoughts. That's what happened to me. Days of being ignored had worn me down to the point where anger no longer made sense. The pain didn't burn anymore, it began to sharpen. The more I sat in silence, the more I started to see things as they truly were. I stopped expecting warmth from cold hearts. I stopped waiting for respect from people who had already decided I no longer deserved it. And then something powerful happened. I started thinking again, but differently this time. Not like a father begging to be understood, but like a man finally waking up after years of emotional sleep. I began to remember details, not the hurtful words or the laughter, but the paperwork, the signatures, the documents tucked away in drawers. I had built this house not just with my hands, but with legal ink and decades of discipline. Every deed, every title, every bank account still in my name. I had never transferred a thing. I'd trusted too much, perhaps, but not enough to surrender the foundation I had worked for. It hit me one morning while I was sipping tea on the porch. Ethan was inside talking loudly on the phone, bragging about his house to someone. His words drifted through the open window, and I couldn't help but smile, not out of spite, but realization. He believed ownership came from presence, from possession, but real ownership comes from ink, and ink doesn't forget. That simple truth grounded me. For years I had mistaken love for obligation and sacrifice for security. I had thought my presence was enough to be respected, but respect isn't something you demand, it's something people choose to give. And once they stop, you have to decide whether to keep chasing it or to walk away with your dignity intact. That's when my pain began to change shape. It wasn't shame anymore, it wasn't sadness, it was focus. The same focus I had, when I was young, building a future from nothing. The kind that wakes you up early and makes your hands steady again. People often think age makes you weak, but age, if you let it, gives you patience, and patience is just another form of quiet power. I realized I didn't need to shout, argue, or fight. I didn't even need revenge. All I needed was to act with clarity and let time do what time always does, reveal truth. I looked around the yard that morning at the doghouse still standing in the corner, its paint chipped, its wood fading. It no longer looked like humiliation to me. It looked like a test, a lesson carved in wood. The pain that once weighed me down had become something else entirely, a kind of fuel, a quiet determination to reclaim what was mine, not out of spite, but out of peace. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't make threats. I just started thinking like a builder again, checking foundations, studying details, preparing for what needed to come next. Because sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one who shouts. It's the one who has stopped shouting and started planning. And that morning I became that man again. Once the fog of anger lifted, I started seeing everything with a kind of calm precision. For the first time in a long while, I looked at my life not as a father drowning in disappointment, but as a man who had quietly built something solid and still held it. One evening, when the house had gone still and the lights in Ethan's room had dimmed, I went to the small wooden desk in my corner of the house. The drawers creaked as I pulled them open. Inside were files I hadn't touched in years, yellowing envelopes, bank passbooks, property deeds, and a safe key I'd nearly forgotten about. I took my time. Each document I unfolded was like a piece of my life's work being rediscovered. There was the mortgage paper from decades ago, the savings account that had carried us through tough winters, the insurance policies I'd set up when Ethan was still a boy. Every page reminded me that despite how he treated me, the ground beneath this house was still mine, literally and legally. I sat back in my chair and let that truth sink in. Age doesn't make you powerless, it just makes you quieter. When you're young, you fight with noise, with pride, with heat. When you're older, you learn that real power comes from what you control in silence. Patience. I realized is its own kind of authority. Most people mistake patience for weakness. They see silence and assume surrender. But real patience, the kind that comes from age and experience, is strength wearing a softer face. I remembered moments in my younger years when I'd lose my temper quickly. I'd argue, shout, push to prove a point. But those outbursts never built anything lasting. The house around me, the life I'd made, had been built not by noise, but by persistence, by showing up every day, by doing what needed to be done even when no one thanked me for it. That night, I locked the papers back in the drawer, checked the safe, and counted every key I owned. The one to the garage, the one to the old truck, the one to the front gate, all still under my name. Each one felt heavier than before, like a quiet reminder that I hadn't lost control. I had only forgotten how much I still held. I thought about Ethan then, how he strutted through the house believing he was the master of it all. Pride had blinded him. He couldn't see the truth right in front of him. The man he dismissed as weak was the one who still kept the lights on, who still paid the bills, who still held the legal weight of everything he touched. That realization didn't fill me with revenge. It filled me with perspective. When someone believes they've already won, they stop watching their step. That's when patience becomes power. I closed the drawer and looked around my small room. Everything looked the same cracked walls, same old chair, same dim lamp, but the air felt different. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt steady. Because I knew something Ethan didn't. You don't need to raise your voice to make a change. Sometimes all you need is time and the wisdom to wait while others destroy themselves with arrogance. That night, as I turned off the lamp, I thought of something my father once told me when I was young and hot-headed. Patience isn't about waiting. It's about knowing when the right moment finally belongs to you. I finally understood what he meant. After that night, I stopped trying to correct Ethan. I stopped explaining, arguing, or reminding him of what I'd done for him. Sometimes silence says more than 1,000 words ever could. He began to walk around the house as if he owned it. I'd hear him on the phone telling friends, "Yeah, it's my place. Got it from my dad years ago." Every time those words reached me, I'd smile faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from joy, but from knowing something the other person doesn't. Pride has a way of making people blind. When someone believes they're untouchable, they stop checking the ground they're standing on. Ethan had reached that point. He wasn't just proud, he was careless. He started redecorating without asking, moving furniture, repainting walls, even changing the locks on rooms he thought were his. He strutted through the hallways like a man who had conquered something, not realizing the throne he was sitting on still belonged to someone else. I didn't stop him. I didn't even react. I wanted him to feel comfortable in his illusion, to believe completely that I had given up, because the moment someone stops fearing consequences, that's when they reveal everything. At dinner, he'd talk louder than usual, boasting about future plans, about renovations, about how he would modernize the place. His wife nodded proudly, beside him, glancing at me from time to time with a look that said she thought I was too old to matter. I let them think that. I let them believe I was fading, that my silence meant defeat. The truth was silence was the only weapon I had left, and it was sharper than they realized. Every word I didn't say made them bolder. Every quiet nod made them believe they were winning. They stopped hiding their conversations, stopped whispering about moving me out. They became confident, predictable. Sometimes I'd pass by Ethan's room and hear him talking about investments and property rights, using terms he barely understood. He had no idea that every plan he made was being built on a foundation that didn't legally belong to him. Watching him, I felt two emotions at once. The first was disappointment, seeing how far he had drifted from humility, from the boy who once looked up to me. The second was clarity. I realized I didn't need revenge, I just needed patience. Pride, if left alone, always builds its own downfall. One afternoon he walked past me in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, saying to someone, "Yeah, this is my home now." The old man doesn't really handle anything anymore. He glanced at me as he said it, almost testing to see if I'd react. I didn't. I just smiled gently and kept folding the laundry. That single moment told me everything I needed to know. He believed the game was over. But he was wrong. The truth was still written on the deeds tucked safely away. His name had never touched them. The walls around him, the land beneath his feet, even the roof above his head, all of it still carried the signature he'd chosen to forget mine. That night I sat in my chair by the window and looked out at the old doghouse again. Its roof was cracked, its wood faded, but it stood firm through every season, every storm. That's what patience is, enduring quietly while the world underestimates you. I realized something then. You don't always need to fight loud battles to win. Sometimes you just wait, because pride left unchecked always builds a trap for itself. And all I had to do was let him walk right into it. After weeks of silence, I decided to test something. Not out of revenge, but out of curiosity, like tapping a wall to see if it's still solid. Late one evening, while Ethan and his wife watched TV in the other room, I sat at my old desk, the one covered with stacks of papers and a lamp that flickered when I touched it. I pulled out a few envelopes and started going through my bills. Electricity, water, insurance, property tax, every single one still came under my name. I thought about that for a while. Then, without overthinking it, I made a small decision. I skipped a payment, just one. The kind of thing that might cause a small ripple if anyone was paying attention. Days passed. Nothing happened. No one noticed. Ethan didn't ask about the mail, didn't check the accounts, didn't even glance at the utility notices that arrived with my name still printed in bold at the top. So I tried something else. I closed one old account, one that quietly covered part of the house's expenses. Again silence, no questions, no concern. It was almost fascinating to watch. Pride had made him blind, not just emotionally, but practically. He had convinced himself that he was in control, that the world worked because he said so. He never once considered that I was still the one keeping it running. I sat there that night sipping tea that had gone cold and thought about how easy it is to forget the hands that keep your world steady. People like Ethan don't notice stability until it's gone. They assume everything just functions on its own. Lights turn on, water flows, doors unlock. But they never ask who's been paying for it all these years. I decided to take one more step. I cancelled an old safety deposit box and transferred its contents to a private account under a new name. It was a small, quiet act. No noise, no confrontation, just a shift in the air. And again, nothing, not even a flicker of awareness. That's when it truly hit me. He wasn't just blind, he was comfortable in his blindness. He believed the world existed to serve him, and that illusion was his greatest weakness. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange mix of calm and power. It wasn't joy or vengeance, it was clarity. For the first time in years, I understood that I could let go, and the moment I did, everything around him would collapse faster than he could scream for help. Because sometimes the only thing holding a man up isn't his strength, but someone else's patience. And mine had finally run its course. The night grew quiet again. The clock ticked softly beside me. I thought about the irony of it all. He believed I had become useless, yet I was the one holding every invisible thread that kept his comfort alive. So I smiled, turned off the lamp, and whispered to myself, half as a warning and half as a promise, when I finally release my hand, the fall will be quicker than he ever imagined. By the time I decided to leave, the anger was gone. What was left wasn't rage or revenge, it was a quiet kind of clarity, the kind that only comes after you've spent too long being hurt. I didn't feel like a man plotting an escape. I felt like someone cleaning out an old room in his heart, finally throwing away what no longer belonged there. One morning, before the house woke up, I sat at my desk with a small notebook and began to write. It wasn't a letter or a goodbye. It was a plan, simple, deliberate, methodical. I listed every account that still carried my name, every asset, every deed, every insurance policy. I wrote down the lawyer's number, the one I hadn't called in years, a man who still owed me a favor from long ago. I noted down a few places I could go, small towns I'd once visited for work, quiet enough for a man to disappear without questions. There was no bitterness in those notes, just order, like a man balancing his books one last time. The pen moved smoothly steady in my hand. My thoughts for the first time in months felt clear. When pain finally exhausts itself, it leaves behind focus. I realized that peace doesn't arrive with noise or confrontation. It comes quietly when you decide to stop begging to be seen. As I wrote, I looked around my small room. The same faded curtains, the same photo of my late wife on the nightstand. Her eyes still looked kind in that picture, as if she knew I'd eventually have to do this to walk away for the sake of my own dignity. I whispered to her photo that morning, almost like confession. I told her I wasn't leaving because of hate. I was leaving because I wanted to breathe again. I packed slowly over the next few days, not in suitcases, just in small, organized piles. A few clothes, important papers, a photo. Nothing more than what could fit in a single bag. The rest of my life would stay here, buried in walls that no longer remembered me. I didn't rush, I didn't hide. I still swept the porch, watered the flowers, and made tea every morning. I wanted everything to look the same so no one would sense the shift, but inside I had already left. Each night I went over my notes again, checking for anything I'd missed. Bank names, safe deposit codes, phone numbers, expiration dates. My handwriting was slow but firm. I made no mistakes. I realized something then: leaving doesn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it means reclaiming yourself from a place that no longer deserves your presence. When people talk about peace, they imagine beaches and sunsets. But real peace feels more like this: a slow, steady calm inside you, when you finally stop defending what should have never required defense. I didn't want to hurt Ethan. I didn't want him to suffer. But I did want him to understand what happens when love turns into entitlement. And the only way he would ever learn was through absence, not anger. So I prepared my exit with the same patience I once used to build his life carefully, quietly, with love, even if that love had nowhere left to live. By the time the notebook was full, I closed it gently and placed it beside my bed. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel doubt. Only a strange, unfamiliar steadiness, because sometimes the most powerful moment in a man's life isn't when he fights back, it's when he finally stops. When I finally picked up the phone to call Harrison, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closure. He had been my friend once, back when we were both young men trying to find our place in the world. I helped him get his first big case by introducing him to a contractor who trusted my word. Decades later, he became a respected lawyer in town, while I had quietly faded into the background of my own family's life. Still, I knew I could count on him to do what needed to be done without questions. The call was short. I told him I needed to review my estate papers and close a few old accounts. My voice was steady, almost too calm. He didn't press for details. He just said, "Come by tomorrow morning." The next day I left before Ethan woke up. The house was still heavy with the kind of silence that comes before change. I walked past the photographs on the wall, birthdays, holidays, milestones, and for a second I wondered how many of them had meant as much to him as they did to me. Then I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me without looking back. Harrison's office was in an old brick building downtown. When I walked in, the receptionist gave me a polite smile, the kind reserved for people who look like they've come to settle unfinished business. Harrison came out from his office when he saw me and greeted me with a look that was part surprise, part respect. We had both aged, but time had been kinder to him. "William," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "It's been years." We didn't waste time with small talk. I told him what I wanted: every property, every account, every insurance policy, and every legal tie still in my name. I wanted them closed, transferred, dissolved. Nothing to pass down, nothing to reclaim, nothing left for Ethan to touch. He looked at me carefully, like he was trying to read between the lines of what I wasn't saying. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. I nodded. He opened a folder and began laying out the papers. Each one felt heavier than it should have. Ownership transfers, account closures, legal declarations. Years of work, memories, and sacrifice condensed into a few pieces of paper and a pen. The pen felt smooth in my hand. I paused for a moment before signing, not because I doubted my choice, but because I wanted to feel its finality. Every stroke of ink was a statement louder than any argument I could ever have. I didn't need to shout to reclaim my dignity. The law didn't require anger, it only needed precision. As the pen scratched across the page, I thought about Ethan, how he laughed that night, how he told me to sleep outside like I didn't belong. I remembered the exact sound of his voice when he said it. For a long time I thought those words would echo forever, but in that quiet office they lost their power. Harrison handed me the last document. "When this goes through, it's irreversible," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's the point." When I finished signing, he gathered the papers, neatly sliding them into a folder with a kind of care that matched the weight of the moment. "You're doing something final," he said quietly. "Final doesn't mean wrong," I answered. "It just means done." We sat there for a few seconds, neither of us speaking. Outside the city moved like it always did, cars passing, people rushing, life carrying on. Inside, time felt slower, almost sacred. Harrison finally stood and shook my hand. "You've always been a man of patience," he said. I smiled faintly. Patience only looks like weakness until the results arrive. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and cleansing. I felt lighter. I didn't own anything anymore, at least not on paper, but in a strange way I owned something far more valuable: peace. I walked to a small bench across the street and sat down, watching people hurry past. No one knew what I had just done. No one needed to, because sometimes the loudest victories are written in silence, in ink, and in the quiet resolve of a man who finally stops waiting for others to understand. The morning I left, the world felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention, but makes you notice everything: the sound of the wind brushing against the windows, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the slow rhythm of a house not yet awake. I rose before the sun, careful not to make a sound. My old jacket hung by the door, the same one I'd worn through decades of life. First job's my wedding day, my wife's funeral. Its fabric had grown thin, but it still carried her scent, faint and warm, like time preserved. On the nightstand sat her photo. She was smiling in it, eyes full of light, the way she always looked before life became heavy. I picked it up and kissed the corner, whispering words that weren't prayers but promises. I told her I was finally doing what she once asked me to find in peace, even if I had to walk through loneliness to reach it. I packed light: a few folded shirts, some old documents, a notebook, and that photograph. I didn't need more than what could fit in a small canvas bag. The rest furniture, photos, laughter belonged to a life that had already ended without ceremony. As I stepped into the hallway, the walls felt narrower, the air heavier. Every family picture hanging there told a story that no longer included me. The faces smiled, but none of them remembered who built the frame that held them. When I reached the front door, I paused. The key in my hand was warm, familiar, almost reluctant to leave my grasp. I looked back once more, not out of sadness, but acknowledgement. Some doors you close not to lock something behind, but to free yourself from what's inside. I turned the key in the lock one last time. The soft click echoed like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Then I slid the key under the doormat. It felt right symbolic somehow, because some homes stop being homes long before you ever walk away. Outside, the morning air was cold and sharp, the kind that wakes you completely. The sky was still pale, streaked with early light, and for a moment I stood there breathing it in, feeling the freedom sting my lungs in the best way. I walked down the path I'd once paved myself, each step lighter than the last. The garden I used to tend was overgrown now, the flowers dull from neglect. But I didn't feel regret, just distance, a clean kind of distance. As I reached the gate, I looked back one final time. The house looked smaller than I remembered, fragile even. It wasn't anger that filled me, or grief, or triumph, just quiet understanding. Inside, my son would wake to a world that looked the same but wasn't. The locks would turn, the papers would move, the life he thought he controlled would start to unravel silently, like thread pulled from a sweater. But I would be gone. Not dead, not missing, just absent in a way that mattered most. The bus stop wasn't far. The road stretched ahead, grey and endless, like an invitation. I walked toward it without hurry. I didn't look back again. As the bus arrived, I climbed aboard and sat by the window. The seat was cracked, the cushion worn thin, but it was the softest place I'd rested in years. When the engine started and the house disappeared into the distance, I felt something unexplainable settle inside me. Not joy, not sadness, just freedom. And for the first time in a long time, I realized sometimes you don't need to fix a broken place. You just need to walk away from it before it breaks you too. By the time the sun climbed high that day, the house I once built had become a stage for chaos. Ethan woke late, groggy and unbothered, still wearing the comfort of arrogance like a second skin. He stretched, poured himself a cup of coffee, and opened his phone to order breakfast. A few taps, a quick smile until the app flashed red. Payment declined. He frowned, tried again, same result. Another attempt, declined. He laughed it off at first, muttering about a glitch, but when he reached for his wallet and tried his card in another app, the same message appeared. This time the laugh didn't come. He walked to the garage, pressing the remote for the door. Nothing. Pressed again. Still nothing. The motor didn't hum. The lights inside flickered weakly, then went out. The power was gone. He stormed back inside, shouting for his wife. She came down the stairs with her phone in hand, her voice sharp with irritation. "The Wi-Fi's out again," she said, "and my card just got declined." Before he could respond, his phone started buzzing. One call after another. Banks, lawyers, agents. The sound filled the kitchen like an alarm no one could silence. He answered one, his voice impatient, defensive. The banker's tone on the other end was polite but firm. Accounts frozen, transfers reversed, ownership updates confirmed. Every safety net he thought he had was gone quietly, efficiently, legally. Each word stripped away another layer of his pride. His wife stood by the counter, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. "What's going on, Ethan?" she demanded. "You said everything was in your name." He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was running, trying to piece together what had happened, who could have done it, how it could all unravel so fast. He opened drawers, searched folders, even called out for me. But of course there was only silence, and that silence hit harder than any insult. His wife's frustration turned into fury. She started shouting about the bills, the house, the future she thought she was promised. Her voice cracked her anger, turning into fear. "You said this was yours," she screamed. "You said you owned it." But ownership built on arrogance is like glass. It only looks strong until it's touched. By noon, the house was filled with the sound of collapse. Phones kept ringing, lights flickered, tempers flared. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I once ate breakfast with his mother. His head was in his hands now, eyes unfocused, breathing heavy. He tried calling me again. The phone went straight to voicemail. He tried my lawyer next, but the call never went through. Every number that once led to stability now led nowhere. The world that had always worked for him had stopped moving, and for the first time in his life he realized he wasn't the one who made it spin. His wife left the room, slamming the door behind her. The air was thick, heavy with the sound of defeat. Somewhere in that silence, he must have remembered what he once said to me the night he told me to sleep in the doghouse. I imagined the words echoing in his mind, twisting like a knife. He had laughed that night, proud of his cruelty. But by noon, that laughter had vanished. All that remained was silence, the kind of silence that doesn't fade, the kind that stays, the kind that teaches. By evening, the panic had settled in. Ethan spent the first hour trying to convince himself it was all a misunderstanding, some banking error, a glitch, a temporary freeze that would fix itself by morning. But when the calls stopped being about delays and started using words like irreversible, the denial cracked. He grabbed his keys and stormed out. The sound of the car engine breaking the silence was almost desperate. He drove too fast through familiar streets that had suddenly become foreign. His first stop was the diner I used to visit every Sunday morning. He burst through the door, scanning faces, asking if anyone had seen me. The waitress, a kind woman who always remembered my coffee order, looked up and shook her head. "Haven't seen him in weeks," she said softly. Her tone carried pity, not for me but for him. He left without finishing his sentence. The next stop was my old friend's house, then the library, the park bench near the hardware store, even the cemetery where his mother rested. He stood there for a long time staring at the gravestone, maybe expecting me to appear from the shadows, but the only thing that met him was the wind. By the time the sun began to set, exhaustion had replaced anger. His calls went unanswered. Every road led nowhere. Every place that once tied him to me felt hollow, stripped of warmth, stripped of memory. He didn't realize it yet, but he wasn't chasing me, he was chasing the version of himself that still had control. Eventually he went to the police station. His voice trembled as he filed a missing person report. Not out of concern, not because of love, but because he was afraid. Afraid that my disappearance meant the last thread of his comfort had been cut. He told the officer I was old, maybe confused, maybe lost. The officer nodded politely, filled out the paperwork, and assured him they would look into it. But I wasn't lost. I had simply erased myself. I had planned it that way. No forwarding address, no digital trail, no friends who knew where I went. Even my lawyer, the only person aware of the truth, had promised silence. While Ethan tore through the city searching for me, I was already far away, sitting by a window in a small town where no one knew my name. The sky outside was streaked with the orange glow of sunset. I watched people pass by, a couple walking their dog, a boy riding his bike, a woman carrying groceries, and realized that life goes on perfectly well without noise. Back at my old house, the walls that once echoed with laughter now echoed with confusion. My son would never admit it, but in that moment he understood something he'd never known before. You can't own people, not even the ones who once built your world. He could replace furniture, sell cars, buy new locks, but he couldn't buy back presents. He wanted to find me, not because he missed me, but because he needed me to keep his life from falling apart. And that was exactly why I couldn't go back. Silence. I've learned has no address. It can't be tracked, can't be bought, can't be reasoned with. It just exists, steady and untouchable like peace itself. Somewhere in that silence I finally belonged, and somewhere in his noise he finally realized what it costs to lose the one person who held the world together quietly without ever asking for thanks. The bus dropped me off at a small town called Ravenhill, a quiet place tucked between hills and forests, the kind of town where time seemed to move slower, where even the wind sounded gentler. I stepped off the bus, carrying nothing but one worn bag and the weight of freedom on my shoulders. The streets were narrow and peaceful. Old buildings lined the sidewalks with faded signs and crooked shutters. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang, its sound echoing through the empty morning air. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in the smell of rain on stone, the warmth of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, the hum of a place untouched by hurry. I found a small inn near the edge of town, run by an older couple who greeted me with polite curiosity. When they asked for my name, I paused before answering. Henry, I said, the name my late wife used to call me when she was teasing or softening me after an argument. It felt right to start over with a name that carried love, but no baggage. The room they gave me was simple: a single bed, a wooden chair by the window, a small desk with a lamp that flickered when you touched it just right. It was enough. That first night I slept without fear of footsteps outside my door or laughter coming from another room, just the sound of the wind against the window pane and the quiet hum of my own breathing. I hadn't realized how heavy noise had become until it was gone. Every morning I woke before sunrise and walked to the little bakery down the street. The man behind the counter always greeted me with a nod and handed me a cup of black coffee that tasted stronger than anything I'd had in years. I'd take it outside, sit on a wooden bench near the fountain, and watch the town wake up shopkeepers, sweeping their steps, school children rushing with backpacks, church bells ringing softly in the distance. No one knew my story here. No one whispered behind my back or asked where I'd come from. I was just another face in a quiet town, and that anonymity felt like oxygen. A week later, I bought a small clay pot from a street vendor and planted a single flower on the windowsill of my room. It became part of my morning ritual. Water, the plant make tea, open the window, and let the cool air fill the room. Watching that flower grow reminded me that even after the hardest winters, something new can take root if given peace and patience. Some afternoons I'd take slow walks through town, stopping by the bookstore or sitting near the river to feed the ducks. I didn't speak much to anyone, but people began to recognize me. The baker would save me a roll. The old man who sold newspapers would nod. Even small gestures like that reminded me that kindness doesn't always need history, it just needs presence. Life became light again, not because it was exciting, but because it was simple. No one demanded anything. No one shouted. No one remembered my name. And that was the beauty of it. I started writing again in a small notebook, not about what happened, but about the little things that now mattered, the color of the sky after rain, the way the air smelled before dawn, the laughter of strangers passing by. My handwriting was slower now, but steadier. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried under years of noise. I realized something as the days passed. Peace doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with music or celebration. It just arrives quietly, sits beside you, and stays as long as you let it. And in that silence I discovered something I'd forgotten long ago, how to breathe without waiting for someone to notice. Because real freedom isn't loud, it's gentle, unremarkable, and calm. It's waking up in the morning and realizing no one's calling your name anymore, and for the first time that's exactly what you need. Time moved on as it always does. But for Ethan, it didn't move forward. It circled back over and over to the same empty house, the same unanswered questions, the same silence he couldn't escape. At first he tried to fix things. He made calls, begged for extensions, tried to reopen accounts that no longer existed. The more he tried, the more he realized the damage wasn't financial, it was foundational. Every comfort he had taken for granted, every illusion of control had vanished with the man he once called burden. Within months the house began to fall apart. The lights dimmed, the walls cracked, and the rooms that had once echoed with arrogance now sat in heavy, unrelenting quiet. Friends stopped visiting. The ones who used to laugh at his stories avoided his calls. Reputation fades fast when wealth disappears. Pride fades faster. When the bank notices arrived, he sold off furniture, then the car, then pieces of the house itself, just to pay the debt he didn't even understand how he'd created. Each signature on those papers was a mirror of the one I'd left behind, his hand shaking not from age but from shame. Neighbors whispered. Some pitied him. Others smirked behind curtains, remembering how loud he used to be. Even his wife, once so proud, grew restless. Their arguments turned into silence, and that silence turned into distance. One morning she packed a single suitcase and walked out without a word. He sat alone on the porch that evening, staring at the same yard where he once mocked me. The doghouse still stood there, faded and small, a hollow box that had outlived its purpose. For the first time he noticed how fragile it looked. I imagine he thought of me, then maybe even spoke to the air, asking questions only regret can answer. Maybe he wondered how I could leave without looking back, how I could disappear so completely. But I hadn't vanished. I had simply stopped existing in his world. In another town far from his noise, I lived quietly. My days were simple mornings with tea afternoons, with sunlight through the window evenings, with peace so deep it almost felt like music. I planted flowers on the balcony of my small apartment and watched them bloom patient and unhurried, like time healing itself. I didn't read the news, I didn't ask about him, but sometimes I'd catch a thought drifting in soft, uninvited like memory. Not bitterness, not satisfaction, just understanding. He had told me once to sleep with the dog, and now as I slept each night in silence, I realized the irony. He was the one awake, haunted, restless, carrying the weight of his own cruelty. Peace doesn't always come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from distance, from letting time teach the lesson you never could. I didn't need to see his downfall to know it happened. Pride always pays its own debts. I lived the rest of my life quietly with no riches, no fame, no audience, just stillness. And in that stillness, I learned what true wealth is: waking up each day, without anger, without fear, without anyone's permission to exist. And somewhere far from my peace, I knew my son had finally learned his own lesson, not through lectures or punishment, but through absence. The kind of absence that echoes louder than any voice. He once ordered me to sleep beside the dog. Now I sleep in peace, and he wakes every night beside his regret.